of April 20th through the 24th. This is one of our last 6 slides. This is actually going to be our last architecture slide. So let's go ahead and get into it. As my slide gets a little bit bigger for us. Okay, so the name of this one is called The House in New Castle, and this is located in Delaware. It's in northern Delaware. It's done from 1978 to 83. Wood frame and stucco. And the architects, there's 3 architects. The prime architect, his name is Robert Venturi. You also have John Rausch, and then you also have a third architect who's actually married to Robert Venturi. So her name is Denise Scott Brown. And we can classify this as postmodern architecture. So we are moving away from the skyscrapers, the less is more theory by Mies van der Rohe, and we're going to actually go back a little bit into studying from what we've already studied, how architects sometimes like to reference the past. So we'll kind of talk a little bit about that with Venturi today. So, just a couple things if you want to note for your image. This is one of your images, and then you also have an interior image that we'll get to very soon. Just a couple things if you want to note. So, for like this overhang, if it reminds you of anything, the triangular shape that's in front of a building, like the entryway, begins with a P. This is kind of classified as like a pediment. This is made out of stucco. And then the actual building, the house itself, is going to be made out of wood siding. They used wood shingles. And there's some things about it that we're going to discuss further on as far as the design and the characteristics that it follows. However, we can, again, classify this as postmodern architecture. This is not in any way similar to the international style. So we don't see any sort of like a flat roof. We don't see any use of like the windows that are going from end to end of each side of this house. We're moving a little bit away from that. So this is again called postmodern architecture. All right, so just a couple things for background info for Robert Venturi and his wife. Again, her name was Denise Scott Brown. They're associated again with the postmodern architecture. This is in the 60s, and Venturi actually wrote a highly influential book. I feel like for most of these architects that we've studied throughout time, they always have a book. So his book was called The Complexities and Contradictions in Architecture. And actually, MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, published this, in which he criticized the rigid rules of modern architecture, as seen in the glass and steel cubic skyscrapers proliferating throughout the world. So he's kind of going against that modern, approach as far as how to construct buildings and what they should represent. So again, while we are on that subject of the modern architecture, you might think of Mies van der Rohe. He's the one that did the Seagram building that we recently have studied. He's part of that international high modern focus on pure geometric form, clean lines, no sort of ornamentation, all basically coming from that machine aesthetic, which even goes back a little bit more referencing Le Corbusier's Villa Savoy. So Venturi thought its rigidity had become a straitjacket for architects. Basically, he's kind of saying not some very nice things, as populating with impersonal, cold, sterile. He even says the word soul-killing or boring buildings. He's even criticizing what Mies stood for, while he said less is more. Venturi is saying less is a bore. So maybe that could be a way you could associate with this house in Newcastle. So basically, he advocated moving beyond the modern so that architecture could. There's a couple things I want you to kind of just write down right now. So again, with this less is more of what me stood for, Venturi is saying now less is a bore, and he's advocating to go past the modern set of architecture characteristics. And I want you to reference these, so that's what we can classify this under. He wants to first reference architecture from the past. Okay, so if you can just write that down. So that's referencing to basically do new free new interpretations Um, and what is significant is when he was in school, he studied at one point in Rome in the 50s, where he developed a partially towards post-Renaissance architecture style. So we're going to actually see some of those characteristics show again, referencing, you can even think back to the one house that we studied, the Thomas Jefferson house, and how he was referencing some classical characteristics. So number two, again, number one is include reference to the architecture from the past. Number two, I want you to write down is include ornamentation. Okay, so this is totally against the modern view. So with these additions, there it gives a little bit more of a meaning for people using the structure and alluding to their traditions and locations. It gives a little bit more personality to it. Okay. Number three is going to be the use of traditional materials again. Again, number three is use of traditional materials, so such as like wood, brick, and stone. Postmodern architecture, um, well, yeah, from the 1970s to present. That's what postmodern architecture is standing for. Basically, it observes all those, and also noted for number four. So again, just use of traditional materials. Number four is going to be creativity and individual expression. So again, that's kind of going into like what number two was, include ornamentation. So again, breaking the rules of buildings so that buildings can now have some sort of personality and reflect those of the architects. So giving a little bit more, again, just some personality touch to it, so you can even further identify who that architect was, and the patrons. And I think you could even clearly see that with Frank Lloyd Wright, with this Falling Water. Number five is going to be mixtures of colors, textures, materials, historical influence. So one more time, mixtures of colors, textures, materials, and historical influence. So this is referencing a word, it's called eclecticism. So if you ever heard that term before, or maybe you're someone that collects certain things or just has like an abundance of like random objects, that's kind of like what eclectic means. And then number six is oftentimes a sense of playfulness, including decoration with no function. So this is totally against what Louis Sullivan did for the Carson Peary Scott building, where his philosophy was form follows function. He's going against that. So he's alluding to the fact, again, you can have some personality, you can have some decoration, you can make things just not even have a purpose for ornamentation or a part of a function. He's wanting to kind of revive that a little bit. Okay, so just to wrap this one up, so Venturi, Rausch, and Scott Brown built this in Delaware. There are 18th century classical barns with generous scale and low horizontal proportions. So this is actually referencing like a barn. The walls of these barns are fieldstone with wood frame and siding, and we base this form and symbolism of the house of the indigenous architecture to make it look at home in its rural setting and conform the way of living our clients envision. So they're kind of going off of what the clients, they actually have a little bit of say as to how the design is going to work. So in a sense, like they're kind of working, it's not solely just the vision of the architect. And what the function for this actual house was, it was a man living here. He was really into watching birds. So he's like a bird watcher. So the side of the house facing the woods has big windows and a flattened arched and a pediment in front of the windows, and it acts as kind of like a blind. So what that's this kind of like feature right here. So the birds don't see the bird watcher. It's kind of camouflaged, as they can like look through the windows that are right behind it. So some of these resemble the shapes and materials from the 18th century barn. There's just a couple things if you can just note down some characteristics to this, and then we'll be wrapping up for this one. It is asymmetrical, so you can even see it through the drawing. Okay, so you do have a little bit of sense of like some windows over here. If it was symmetrical, you would see some windows being balanced on the opposite side, but we don't see that necessarily. So classify this as asymmetrical. Again, it does reference some of the classic architecture, such as like the facade. Okay, so like that entrance. And then with that being said, it's clearly referencing, if you guys can recognize these types of columns, they're called Doric columns. And what's kind of significant also is if you were to look at this from the side, not necessarily that you can see, I think this is on the other side, but notice how it's flat. That's what I just wanted for you to kind of notice. I don't think I included any other photos. So um, necessarily these columns are flat. And let's see. They are flat and defy classical proportions, and the arch inside the pediment, okay, if you see that arch that's inside this pediment above, is oversized and flat on its surface. So again, just showing that it's actually all completely flat. And this is again the other side of it, but you can of the house, but you can kind of see that same repetition going on. Okay, let's just talk for a minute about the interior because that's kind of interesting. It shows um, basically just some bold colors and patterns. You see some playfulness. It's almost like you see, they reference the word Easter eggs, Easter egg colors, so that could allude to maybe like more like pastel colors, and I think that's where they're getting kind of that idea, especially with the way that these columns are inside by the ceiling, not columns, excuse me, the way that you have these overhangs that are near the ceiling. You kind of see those pastels coming, those mint, the kind of like the cream, kind of like a baby bluish kind of color popping through. So again, it's referencing a little bit of some ornamentation, um, bold colors and patterns, very playfulness. Again, kind of like the decor of Easter egg colors. Looks kind of almost like they're classifying it as folk architecture with even if you can classify this chandelier, they're saying it looks pretty whimsical. The woman that was living here, she was a musician, so I think you can clearly see it almost looks like she could put on her own concert. And this was basically her music room where all her instruments um, would be able to have the ability to have friends come over, gather, and listen to music. Okay, that's really about all it that we got for the Robert Venturi house. This is House of New Castle. All right, this is Mrs. Howard signing out.